Persecution and discrimination, a key driver of forced displacement. Persecution is among the most deeply entrenched and painful causes of forced displacement. Unlike sudden natural disasters or abrupt conflicts, persecution is often a slow, grinding process, sometimes spanning years or even generations, characterized by exclusion, systemic abuse, and persistent fear. This relentless oppression eventually reaches a critical breaking point, forcing individuals and communities to flee their homes in search of safety. What makes persecution especially devastating is that it targets people for who they are, their identity, beliefs, or existence. Whether based on religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, political views, or social status, persecution isolates victims and marks them as threats in the eyes of those in power. Often, governments do more than tolerate this abuse. They are actively responsible, denying victims protection, or even persecuting them through law and policy. Forced displacement driven by persecution is therefore not just about escaping immediate violence. It's about fleeing a system that denies fundamental human rights and dignity. One of the most chilling and persistent forces driving people from their homes around the world is political persecution. This is not an abstract idea. It is the deliberate targeting of individuals, sometimes entire communities, simply because they dare to think differently, to speak out, or to demand accountability from those in power. In many parts of the world today, exercising your basic rights, like freedom of speech, the right to protest, or the right to vote, is not a civic duty, but a dangerous act of defiance. In authoritarian or repressive regimes, governments often respond to dissent with brutal force. They use surveillance, arbitrary imprisonment, torture, and even assassination to silence those who oppose them. Political persecution is not just an attack on individuals. It is an attack on democracy, on civil society, and on the rule of law itself. When courts are corrupted, when the media is muzzled, when the police and military serve only to protect the regime, where does one turn for justice? For millions, the only answer is to run. Fleeing political persecution becomes a survival strategy, not a choice. Let me take you now to Myanmar, a nation gripped by military dictatorship since the 2021 coup. While the world is familiar with the horrors inflicted upon the Rohingya minority, political persecution in Myanmar goes far beyond that. The military junta has waged war not just against ethnic minorities, but against its own citizens, activists, journalists, and ordinary people who took to the streets to demand democracy. Thousands have been arrested. Many have been tortured. Some have simply disappeared. Others have fled across borders into Thailand, India, or further afield, seeking refuge from a regime that sees peaceful protest as treason. Next, let us look at Belarus, a country in the heart of Europe that erupted in protest after the widely disputed 2020 presidential election. Citizens poured into the streets to demand change, and the government responded with violence. Detainees were tortured. Protesters were beaten. Journalists were silenced. Human rights groups were dismantled. Fearing arrest or worse, many Belarusians have escaped to neighboring countries like Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. Some have found asylum, but many remain in limbo, caught between authoritarianism at home and uncertain futures abroad. And of course, we cannot ignore Venezuela, where political persecution goes hand in hand with economic collapse. Under the leadership of Nicolás Maduro, the regime has used every tool of repression to stay in power. Intimidation, arbitrary arrests, forced disappearances, and the criminalization of dissent. Political opponents have been jailed or exiled. Protesters have been shot. Independent voices in the media have been silenced. Combined with a collapsed economy and widespread humanitarian need, political persecution in Venezuela has forced millions to flee one of the largest displacement crises in the world today. These are not isolated stories. They are part of a global pattern in which political persecution strips people of their rights, their protections, and their futures. What unites these cases is not just the violence or fear, but the systematic destruction of the institutions that are meant to protect citizens. When the courts no longer deliver justice, when the press is no longer free, when Parliament is reduced to a rubber stamp, people know they cannot survive by staying silent, and they cannot survive by staying at all. And so they leave, often in the middle of the night, often alone, often unsure if they will ever return. We must never forget that behind every refugee statistic is a human being who once believed in the power of their voice, who once trusted in the promise of justice. Political persecution doesn't just force people to flee their homes, it forces them to flee their dreams, their dignity, and often their very identity. One of the most painful forces driving displacement across the globe is persecution rooted in ethnicity and religion. In many societies, being born into a particular ethnic or faith group is enough to make someone a target, for exclusion, for violence, and ultimately for exile. Take the Rohingya of Myanmar. Denied citizenship since 1982, they've lived as outsiders in their own country, confined to camps, barred from education, healthcare, or movement. Then, in 2017, this decades-long discrimination erupted into horrific violence. Entire villages were burned, families were slaughtered. Over 700,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh, where they now live in crowded camps with little hope of return. In China, the Uyghur Muslim minority faces state-led persecution under the guise of counter-terrorism. Over 1 million Uyghurs are reportedly detained in what the Chinese government calls re-education centers. But the world knows better. These are internment camps, places of forced labor, religious suppression, and psychological trauma. Uyghurs outside China often find no safety either, as international pressure and surveillance follow them across borders. The Yazidis of Iraq endured genocide at the hands of ISIS. In 2014, thousands were killed in Sinjar. Women and girls were enslaved and trafficked. The trauma remains fresh. Many Yazidis are still in camps, waiting for justice, security, and a chance to rebuild shattered lives. Christian minorities in Iraq and Syria, who have lived in the region for centuries, were also devastated by extremist violence. ISIS gave them a cruel choice: convert, flee, or die. Ancient communities in Mosul and the Nineveh Plains were emptied almost overnight. In Pakistan, Ahmadis face constitutional discrimination and social hostility. Legally declared non-Muslim, they are often attacked, jailed, or forced to flee simply for practicing their faith. Places of worship are destroyed. Textbooks label them heretics. An asylum becomes the only lifeline. The Tigrayans of Ethiopia endured ethnic profiling and violence during the year of 2020 to 2022 conflict. The government and allied forces reportedly detained Tigrayans in mass without cause, denying them aid and safety. For many, ethnicity alone became a death sentence. Even in Europe, persecution persists. Roma communities, long scapegoated and marginalized, face systemic discrimination. In countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia, Roma are often denied education, housing, and healthcare. Many live in segregated settlements, pushed to the edges of society, and forced into internal migration. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, ethnic clashes between Hema and Lendu communities have led to massacres, child soldier recruitment, and mass displacement. Civilians flee villages turned into war zones, carrying only trauma and uncertainty. These stories are not isolated. They show how religious and ethnic identity, something inherited, not chosen, can endanger a person's entire existence. The homes people are fleeing are not simply places of war. They are places where identity itself becomes a weapon used against them. While ethnicity and religion often dominate headlines, another form of persecution drives millions into exile each year. Persecution based on gender, sexual orientation, and social status. Across the world, LGBTQ+ individuals live in fear, not only of stigma, but of the state. In more than 60 countries, same-sex relationships are criminalized. In some, like Uganda, recent laws mandate life imprisonment or even capital punishment for homosexuality. In Chechnya, harrowing reports have emerged of secret prisons where gay men are tortured or disappeared. In parts of the Middle East, LGBTQ+ people face daily threats from their communities, their governments, and even their families. For transgender individuals, persecution is compounded by a lack of legal recognition. Without ID documents that reflect their gender, they are locked out of employment, healthcare, and protection. Many flee to seek safety, only to encounter asylum processes that re-traumatize them, asking them to prove their identity to skeptical authorities. Persecution also takes the shape of caste-based discrimination, especially in South Asia. Dalits and other marginalized castes face violence, exclusion from public services, and deep-rooted social stigma. In rural areas, caste-based assaults are still shockingly common. People are often driven to migrate internally or internationally in search of dignity and safety. Women and girls, too, face unique dangers. In conflict zones and repressive societies alike, they are disproportionately targeted. From rape used as a weapon of war, to forced marriage, female genital mutilation, and trafficking, gender-based violence is both a cause and consequence of displacement. Even in refugee camps, safety is far from guaranteed. And then there is the haunting reality of statelessness. People who belong to no recognized country, often due to bureaucratic exclusion or identity-based discrimination, find themselves trapped. Without citizenship, they have no passport, no legal protections, and no rights under the laws of asylum or international travel. Statelessness strips away not only mobility, but humanity. These are not just personal tragedies, they are systemic failures. When people are persecuted for who they are, whether because they are gay, trans, poor, female, or from the wrong caste, it reflects societies that have weaponized identity as a form of control. And so, these stories of displacement are not just about physical safety. They are about the fight for recognition, for dignity, and for the right to exist without fear. When we talk about forced displacement, we must understand, people are not just fleeing violence. They are fleeing systems that deny their right to exist, systems that criminalize their identity, erase their culture, or reduce their worth to their religion, gender, or sexuality. We must respond not only with compassion, but with accountability. Because no one should have to run from who they are.